Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet, calculated, and not so glamorous world of organized crime. The kind that didn't wear pinstripe suits or whisper secrets in alleyways. The kind that ruled from kitchens, backrooms, and social clubs with more coffee than bullets. This is not a story of car chases or cinematic betrayals. This is a slow burn, decades long, about how a group of men from a small island off the coast of Italy quietly took root in America and grew into something that changed everything. So, before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something warm, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. Let's start simple. Cosa Nostra. The name itself means our thing. Not a club, not a gang, not a brotherhood, just a thing. Something understood, not explained. Something whispered, not shouted. Born in Sicily, shaped by blood feuds, power vacuums, and the belief that no one outside the circle could be trusted, it was less an organization and more a way of life. Rules, silence, respect, vengeance. It grew in the shadows of poverty and mistrust. And when its seeds crossed the Atlantic, it didn't land with a bang. It landed with a handshake. The early 1900s saw millions of Italians immigrate to America. Most of them wanted honest work, factories, railroads, fishing docks. But America wasn't welcoming. Signs read, "No Italians." Wages were low, conditions worse. In places like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, Italians built their own neighborhoods, and where the government failed them, they looked inward, toward family, toward community, and sometimes toward old-world ways of handling problems. Enter the Black Hand, not quite the Mafia, not yet, but a sign of things to come. Extortion letters, threats written in shaky ink, and a promise of violence if payment wasn't made. It wasn't organized. It wasn't even smart. But it worked, because fear always works. And behind some of those threats were men who knew how to make them real. Former enforcers from Palermo, disgraced soldiers from the old country. They found each other. They remembered the code. And slowly, something started to take shape. It didn't look like much at first. A butcher who could make a problem go away. A barber who knew who to trust. A grocer who handled cash with unusual confidence. They weren't flashy. They didn't want attention. That was the point. But behind closed doors, the rules were being set. Loyalty mattered. Talking to police didn't. If someone crossed the line, they were dealt with quietly, permanently. Then came prohibition. The government outlawed alcohol, and in doing so, opened a door wide enough for organized crime to walk through wearing polished shoes. This was the moment. The small-time operators, the local toughs, they either faded or adapted. The Mafia didn't just adapt, it evolved. It saw opportunity, structure, and most of all, profit. No more street-level feuds over cheese deliveries. This was big. Trucks, routes, bribes, and at the center, men who could run an operation like a business, but enforce it like a war. One of those men was Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria. Born in Sicily, he made his way up through the ranks in New York, controlled parts of Manhattan, had soldiers, lieutenants, and influence. But he wasn't the only one. There was another, Salvatore Maranzano, also Sicilian, also ambitious. They didn't share well, and when powerful men with fragile egos fight over millions in illegal booze money, things get ugly. What followed was the Castellamarese War, a bloody, drawn-out conflict between factions, both claiming to be the rightful rulers of Italian organized crime in America. Streets ran red, alliances shifted, trust vanished, and while Masseria and Maranzano traded blows, someone else watched, learned, waited. His name was Charles Lucky Luciano, and unlike the old bosses, Luciano wasn't interested in tradition for tradition's sake. He respected the code, but he respected efficiency more. He saw the waste, the ego, the violence without purpose, and he knew there was a better way. So he played the game, shook hands, made deals, and when the time was right, he made his move. It happened quietly. Masseria was lured to a restaurant. Luciano excused himself. Moments later, gunmen entered. The job was done. Weeks later, Maranzano was stabbed in his office. No more bosses, just Lucky. And what he did next would define the Mafia for the next 50 years. But we'll get to that. For now, understand this. Cosa Nostra didn't conquer America by force. It conquered it by filling a void. Wherever there was a need for protection, they offered muscle. Wherever there was a market for vice, they built supply. And wherever there was a politician open to a quiet envelope of cash, they found common ground. They weren't loud, they weren't reckless, they were careful, patient, and very good at staying one step ahead. And that, more than anything, is what made them powerful. By the early 1930s, Charles Lucky Luciano had done something no one else had. He turned the fractured, violent mess of Mafia factions into a functioning system. Not perfect, not peaceful, but manageable. He called it the Commission, a board of directors for organized crime. Each major family had a seat. Disputes were settled with votes, not bullets, mostly. And just like that, the American Mafia became something else. Not just a gang, not just a network, a business. Luciano knew that fighting over scraps in alleyways didn't build power. Controlling unions, ports, and city contracts did. So that's where he turned. He formed alliances, not just with Sicilians, but with Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Old-school bosses hated it, but Luciano didn't care. He believed in profit over pride, and in his world, money didn't care where you were born. Through Lansky, Luciano tapped into gambling, hotels, and money laundering. Through Siegel, he saw the potential in Las Vegas before it was neon and noise. But his true genius was logistics. Luciano understood that crime, like any business, needed infrastructure. Trucks to move goods, longshoremen to protect cargo, judges to look the other way. And he built it all. Still, success painted a target. And eventually, the government came knocking. In 1936, Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey brought Luciano to trial, not for murder, extortion, or racketeering, but for something messier, prostitution. Dewey knew it would stick. The trial was sensational. Witnesses were coached. Evidence was circumstantial. But the jury was convinced. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years. It should have been the end. But Luciano's reach didn't stop at prison walls. Even behind bars, he moved pieces, made calls, issued orders, and then something unexpected happened. The war. World War II changed everything. The U.S. government needed help. German submarines were attacking ships near New York. The docks were vulnerable. And the Mafia? They controlled the docks. In 1942, a quiet agreement was made. The Navy reached out to Lansky. Lansky reached out to Luciano. Protection was promised, sabotage prevented. And in return, Luciano's sentence was commuted. In 1946, he was deported to Italy, but his legacy stayed. The system he built didn't collapse. It evolved. Back in the States, new names took center stage. Frank Costello, the so-called Prime Minister of the underworld, ran things with charm and connections. Where Luciano was strategy, Costello was diplomacy. He cultivated politicians, judges, and even television hosts. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. When he spoke, people listened. And when he smiled, favors happened. It wasn't just about crime anymore. It was about influence. Then there was Vito Genovese. Genovese didn't smile. He didn't charm. He wanted power, pure and undiluted. While Costello played the long game, Genovese played rough. He waited, watched, and in 1957 made his move. Costello was shot in the head. Miraculously, he survived. But he got the message. He stepped down. Genovese took over. But ambition, especially loud ambition, rarely lasts. That same year, Genovese gathered bosses from across the country in Appalachian, New York. A summit meant to show unity. Instead, it showed the FBI exactly what they needed. The meeting was raided. Dozens of mobsters were arrested or questioned. For the first time, the government couldn't deny it. The Mafia was real, organized, national, and the public, they paid attention. Newspapers printed names, photos, maps of criminal networks. The term Cosa Nostra entered the mainstream, no longer just a whisper. Now it was a headline. But the truth was, the Mafia didn't collapse under scrutiny. It adapted, quieted, reorganized. That was its strength. For every flamboyant boss who made the papers, there were 5 more who didn't. They ran restaurants, dry cleaners, trucking companies. On the surface, ordinary. But behind the scenes, they moved money, fixed bids, and kept the machine running. Not with violence, but with subtlety. Because real power isn't loud, it's patient. And as the 1950s turned into the 60s, that power grew. The 1960s were a strange time for the Mafia. Outside, the world was changing. Protests, long hair, new music, new wars. But inside the families, things stayed mostly the same. The suits were still pressed, the rules still mattered, and the structure, that invisible web of power and silence, still held strong. Cosa Nostra didn't need to scream. It just had to keep working. But even quiet empires leave shadows. By now the Mafia had its hands in everything, not just gambling and loan sharking, but restaurants, ports, construction, and unions, especially the unions. If you wanted to pour concrete in New York, drive a truck in Chicago, or build a casino in Vegas, someone had to get paid first. And that someone wasn't in an office downtown. He was in the back of a social club, sipping espresso and nodding once if the answer was yes. The strength of the Mafia wasn't in how many men it had. It was in how deep its fingers reached. Local cops, city inspectors, business owners, judges, everyone had a reason to look the other way. Some were scared, some were greedy, most were just practical. Because in many places, the Mafia got things done faster, cleaner, and cheaper than the government ever could. It wasn't just about violence. It was about order. If you borrowed money and paid it back, no problem. If you missed a payment, you'd get a reminder, sometimes with a visit, sometimes with a cracked rib. But it was still business, predictable, almost polite in its own way. And for many working-class families, the Mafia wasn't a threat. It was a fact of life, like bad weather. You didn't fight it. You just adjusted your plans around it. Still, not everyone liked the quiet. Some bosses wanted more money, more cities, more control. One of them was Carlo Gambino. Unlike Genovese, Gambino didn't crave headlines. He preferred shadows. He smiled more than he talked. And when he did speak, people leaned in. Born in Palermo, he came to America young, rose quietly, waited patiently, and when the time came, he took over the family that now bore his name. The Gambino family didn't become powerful overnight. It grew slowly, carefully. Carlo built alliances with the other families, but he never showed too much strength. He let others play king while he played humble. But behind the scenes, his family ran ports, unions, trucking, and had heavy presence in New York and beyond. He was the most powerful man in the country that no one outside his circle had ever heard of. And that's how he liked it. Under Gambino, Cosa Nostra entered what some would call its golden era. The money flowed. The commission met regularly. Disputes were settled with fewer funerals. And for a while, it worked. Cities ran smoothly. Contracts got filled. Politicians got elected. And the Mafia, though never legal, became institutional. Like the post office, but with better suits. Of course, there were still problems. The FBI hadn't forgotten Appalachian, and slowly, piece by piece, they began to build a picture, not just of one family, but of the whole structure. Surveillance, wiretaps, informants. The Bureau was changing. It was no longer just men in hats reading files. It was agents in vans listening to club conversations. It was wire-wearing insiders making deals. And at the top of the FBI's list was a new priority: organized crime. But for the Mafia, this wasn't new. They'd always assumed someone was watching. That's why the rules existed. No written records, no phones for business, no saying Mafia, Cosa Nostra, or even calling someone a boss. Just nicknames, nods, and coded phrases. He's a friend of ours meant something. He's a friend of mine meant something else. If you knew, you knew. If you didn't, you weren't supposed to. That silence kept them safe, and yet cracks were forming. Some of the younger guys weren't as careful. Some got greedy. Some thought they were smarter than the rules. Others just didn't want to play by them anymore. And slowly, the seeds of future problems were planted. But at the time, few noticed, because the money still came in, the clubs stayed open, and the streets stayed quiet. Carlo Gambino ruled not through fear, but through discipline. If someone stepped out of line, they disappeared. If a rival made noise, he found a reason to stop talking. He didn't need guns on tables, just a raised eyebrow and a long pause. That was enough. And when Gambino walked down Mulberry Street, shopkeepers nodded, not because they were scared, but because they knew. The man who really ran the city wasn't in City Hall. He was already here. By the early 1970s, Carlo Gambino was aging, but not slowing. He rarely appeared in public. He didn't give interviews or wear flashy rings. He lived in a modest home on Staten Island, had a quiet routine, and carried himself like someone who had already won. And in many ways, he had. Under his leadership, the Mafia wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. Construction, shipping, garbage contracts, nightclubs, Las Vegas skim. The money moved in circles, always under the surface. Clean businesses washed dirty cash. Dirty businesses pulled in clean-looking revenue. Judges were bought with donations, not threats. Police officers were invited to family dinners, not warned away. Everything stayed polite and dangerous. Gambino's genius wasn't brutality. It was balance. He knew which fights to pick. He knew when to back down. He knew when to step in and when to disappear. And more than anything, he knew people. He understood ambition. He understood fear. And he used both. But he also understood loyalty. If you followed the rules, paid your dues, and showed respect, you were protected. That was the deal. And for years, it worked. But power doesn't freeze. It moves. As Gambino aged, everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who would take his place? He had sons. He had lieutenants. He had rivals watching closely. But the answer surprised many. When Gambino died of natural causes in 1976, he passed the torch not to his own son, but to his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. Castellano was different. He dressed in suits that cost more than most people's cars. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island with white columns and a long driveway. He saw himself not as a gangster, but as a businessman. He didn't hang around clubs or diners. He held meetings at his kitchen table, sipping espresso and reading reports. He avoided the street guys, preferred the company of executives. Some called him Big Paul. Others called him out of touch. Still, he had power. Under Castellano, the Gambino family kept its grip on unions and contracts. But there was tension. The street guys, the ones who had come up through muscle and blood, felt ignored. They didn't want boardrooms. They wanted respect. And one of them, quietly watching, was a man named John Gotti. At the time, Gotti was a soldier, not a boss. But he had charm, swagger, and most of all, ambition. He dressed sharp, talked fast, made friends easily. He came from the streets, understood them, and never tried to pretend otherwise. Where Castellano held meetings behind iron gates, Gotti stood on sidewalks, shaking hands, smiling, listening, waiting. Meanwhile, the government was getting closer. In 1963, years earlier, something had shifted. A made man named Joseph Valachi broke the code. He testified before Congress, named names, described ceremonies, explained how Cosa Nostra worked from the inside. For the first time, the American public saw the Mafia not as a rumor, but as a system. It was real, organized, deep, and it scared people. But inside the Mafia, Valachi was a problem, a warning, a sign that things were changing. By the late 70s, more cracks appeared. Wiretaps, informants, hidden microphones in club walls and restaurant lamps. The FBI no longer denied the Mafia existed. Now they studied it, mapped it, followed it, and slowly arrests increased. Convictions followed, but the system held until something new arrived, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. At first it sounded like just another tool, but it wasn't. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge people not just for what they did, but for what they were part of. You didn't have to pull the trigger. If you ordered it, allowed it, benefited from it, you were guilty. RICO made the top of the pyramid just as exposed as the base, and for the Mafia, it was terrifying. Still, many thought they could beat it. That silence would hold, that tradition would protect them, that the government was just guessing. But things were shifting. Younger members didn't fear the code the way the old ones did. Some flipped, others wore wires, and slowly indictments began to hit higher and higher. And in the middle of it all was Castellano, remote, cold, and increasingly unpopular. He banned drug dealing, said it attracted heat, but many under him ignored the rule, sold anyway, made fortunes, hid the profits, and resented him more with every dollar they had to keep secret. John Gotti saw it all, watched, calculated, and waited, because in his world, respect wasn't inherited. It was taken. By the early 1980s, John Gotti was no longer just a street soldier. He was a captain, a man with his own crew, his own income, and his own following. People respected him because he understood them. He didn't hide behind gates or talk down to anyone. He showed up. He shook hands. He paid his guys on time. And most importantly, he handled problems fast. He had one rule: loyalty above everything. Gotti knew the streets, he knew the rules, and he knew when rules got ignored. Castellano, sitting in his mansion, didn't seem to understand that anymore. The old boss gave orders but didn't listen. He demanded respect but didn't earn it. He banned drug dealing but lived off the profits his men made elsewhere. And worst of all, he trusted the wrong people. He surrounded himself with businessmen, not mobsters, lawyers, accountants, quiet men with clean shoes. But the Mafia wasn't built on briefcases. It was built on loyalty, tradition, and fear. And slowly, Castellano began losing all three. Tensions rose. In 1985, Castellano made a decision that would change everything. He promoted his driver, Thomas Bellotti, to underboss, a man with no experience running crews, no deep connections, just muscle and loyalty to Castellano himself. It was a slap in the face to the rest of the family, especially Gotti. Gotti wasn't just angry, he was ready. He started having quiet conversations, nothing formal, just whispers, in back rooms, in parked cars, over coffee. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He asked questions. What if things were different? What if someone took charge who understood the street, who paid attention, who gave respect? The answers came easily. He wasn't alone. And then, on December 16th, 1985, it happened. Castellano and Bilotti pulled up outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. They were unarmed, unprepared, and within seconds, 4 men stepped out of the crowd. Shots were fired. Both men fell to the pavement. The crowd screamed. The gunman disappeared. And just like that, the most powerful mafia boss in the country was gone. No one was arrested that night. The FBI suspected. The newspapers speculated. But inside the family, everyone understood. This wasn't a mystery. This was a message. And it had been delivered perfectly. Weeks later, John Gotti arrived at a meeting in a suit, nodded to the men around the table, and assumed control of the Gambino family. Not elected, not confirmed, just accepted, because no one had the strength to stop him, and no one wanted to try. The press called him the Teflon Don, because nothing stuck. He was arrested, charged, released, again and again. He walked into courtrooms smiling, walked out untouched. Jurors changed stories. Witnesses disappeared. Lawyers worked miracles. And the public watched it all like a movie. Gotti became a household name, a gangster turned celebrity. He wore $1,000 suits, rode in limousines, waved to cameras, and people loved it. In a city full of stress, crime, and corruption, Gotti looked like control. He looked like power. He looked like someone who made his own rules and didn't care what anyone thought. But inside, cracks were forming. Because the very things that made Gotti popular made him vulnerable. He was too loud, too famous, too open. And while the newspapers loved him, the FBI loved him more. They wanted him gone, and they were willing to wait. The real shift came from inside. His underboss, Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, had been loyal, smart, efficient. He made money. He kept order. He handled problems. But when the FBI caught him on tape, Gotti, in private, blaming Gravano for murders, for mistakes, for heat, something broke. And in 1991, Gravano flipped. The Mafia code of silence, omertà, shattered again. Gravano testified in court, explained everything, names, orders, hierarchy, murders, business, structure, deals. He didn't blink. He told the court how the Mafia really worked, and Gotti, for the first time, couldn't smile his way out. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted. Murder, racketeering, conspiracy. He was sentenced to life without parole. No more limousines, no more cameras, no more restaurants. Just a small cell in a maximum security prison. The Teflon had finally worn off. John Gotti sat in a cell, surrounded by silence. No reporters, no suits, no crew, just bars and walls. The man who once ruled the Gambino family with charm and fear was now reduced to an inmate number. But even in prison, he kept his pride. He refused protective custody, refused to break, refused to act like a man who had lost. But in truth, the era he represented was over. The Mafia was changing, or more accurately, it was shrinking. The old ways no longer worked. Wiretaps were everywhere. Loyalty meant less. Fear had limits. and prosecutors had new tools, better surveillance, and more informants than ever before. RICO cases dragged dozens of men into court at once. One flipped, and the rest followed. And soon, the web began to tear apart. In the 1990s, indictments came in waves, not just Gambino bosses, but leaders from all 5 families: Lucchese, Genovese, Colombo, Bonanno. One by one, they were charged, convicted, discredited. The commission that Luciano had built decades earlier no longer met in private homes. It barely existed at all. The idea of order, of balance between families, had become outdated. Each boss was on his own, and many of them were falling fast. Still, some tried to hold on. There were efforts to regroup, to go quieter, to bring back discipline. The remaining bosses enforced stricter rules. No more media, no more flashy behavior. They encouraged new members to work in real businesses: restaurants, auto repair, construction, anything that looked clean. They hoped to blend back into the background, the way it had been before the headlines and the television coverage. But it wasn't easy. The FBI had momentum. Surveillance had improved. Informants no longer needed secret meetings. They had wires in watches, recorders in pens. Some carried cameras in their shirt buttons, and juries, once skeptical, now believed, because they had seen it before. Over and over, the mob wasn't invisible anymore. It had faces, names, photos, timelines, and records. And the streets were different too. New players had arrived. Other criminal groups were growing: Russian syndicates, Latin American cartels, Asian triads. They moved faster, didn't follow old traditions, and were willing to use far more violence for far less money. The Mafia, once dominant, now had competition, and in many cities they were losing ground. And then there was technology. Old mobsters didn't trust it. They still used payphones, handwritten notes, and cash only. But the world around them had changed. Phones tracked movement. Banks flagged deposits. Emails were monitored. Even garbage was searched. The smallest mistake could bring down an entire crew. And younger members, raised in a digital age, made those mistakes often. Still, tradition lingered. Initiations still happened. A pinprick of blood, a card burned in the hand, a pledge of loyalty to the family above all. But it wasn't the same. The fear had faded. The respect had cracked. The Mafia wasn't dead, but it was aging, slower, smaller, and far less certain. By the late 1990s, the mob had become something else. Not gone, but quieter, less visible, still in construction, still in garbage hauling, still present at union meetings, but no longer at the center of American crime. It had been replaced by groups with faster methods, fewer rules, and a deeper understanding of modern risk. And yet, it remained. In parts of Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens, the old names still carried weight. Social clubs still had backrooms. Old men still drank espresso and spoke in whispers. And every now and then, a headline would appear. A body found, an indictment made, a courtroom filled with quiet men in dark suits. And people would wonder, is the Mafia still here? The answer was yes, just different. It had learned to survive by disappearing, by remembering that True power was never loud. It didn't sit for interviews. It didn't wear flashy watches. It didn't post photos. It watched. It waited. And it whispered. John Gotti died in prison in 2002. Cancer, not bullets, ended his story. And when he passed, few from the outside world were surprised. The cameras came back one last time. Obituaries were written. Documentaries aired. But inside the Mafia, his death was more than a footnote. It was a closing chapter. The last truly public boss was gone. After Gotti's death, the Gambino family entered a strange period. Not leaderless, but cautious. The spotlight had burned them once, and no one wanted to be the next name on a headline. The new bosses operated differently. No more public appearances, no more sound bites, just silence and subtlety. In a way, it was a return to older values. Meetings went back to diners, basements, car rides. Phones were avoided. Orders were passed by hand or whispered during walks. If you had to explain what you were doing, you were already doing it wrong. The new generation of leaders didn't need to be famous. They needed to survive. But survival had changed. The American Mafia of the 2000s was no longer a monolith. It was fragmented, regional, smaller. Some cities barely had a presence. Others held on through tradition. New York remained the heart. But even there, the reach was weaker. Many of the crews had been reduced. Some were gone completely. Others were still active but moving with the weight of memory, not the momentum of growth. And the money, while steady, wasn't what it used to be. Gone were the massive casino skims. Gone were the union empires. Even loan sharking, once a pillar, had changed. People borrowed online. Debts were digital. Gambling had moved to apps and websites. The old ways weren't dead, but they were fading. And for the younger generation of made men, this created a problem. They were part of something sacred, but also something increasingly outdated. Some adapted. They moved into new schemes: identity theft, credit card fraud, online scams, less tradition, more improvisation. But with new crimes came new risks. Digital footprints were harder to erase. Law enforcement had caught up, and many of the new earners lacked the discipline of their predecessors. They spent too much, talked too much, trusted the wrong people. The FBI kept watching. Even after decades of convictions and confessions, agents continued to monitor old clubs, family gatherings, funerals. They knew the signs. A quiet restaurant with a back table always reserved. A man in his 60s who never carried a phone. A cash business with no customers but perfect books. These were clues, not proof, but enough to start watching. And sometimes that was all it took. One wiretap, one informant, one overheard conversation. It didn't take much. And when someone flipped, as they often did, the whole operation unraveled. Because RICO still worked. If one man confessed, the rest faced the fallout. The pyramid structure, once a strength, had become a weakness. Still, loyalty remained. In some corners, especially among older members, the code still held. Silence, honor, family above all. These weren't just words. They were lived principles, passed down from fathers to sons, taught over dinner tables, reinforced by story and ritual. And even if the world outside had changed, inside those circles, the values remained. There were still initiations, still blood pricked from fingers, still vows made in candlelight, still cards burned as symbols of devotion. These ceremonies weren't just formalities. They were anchors. They reminded men that what they were part of wasn't just crime. It was history, a living connection to ancestors, villages, generations, and for some, that mattered more than the money. Because at its heart, Cosa Nostra was never just about profit. It was about belonging, about being part of something older and deeper than the law. It offered protection, identity, and meaning, especially for those who felt like outsiders in the world around them. And in that sense, even as the empire shrank, the idea still held power. It wasn't just a criminal network, it was a culture, and culture doesn't vanish overnight. So, the Mafia continued, in pockets and shadows, in whispered meetings and cautious deals, no longer at the center of American crime, but still woven through certain neighborhoods and families, a relic to some, a legacy to others, a threat to a few, but always present, because some things refuse to disappear completely, not with arrests, not with headlines, not even with time. The early 2010s brought more of the same: indictments, surveillance, quiet arrests that barely made the news. The Mafia no longer drew headlines the way it once had. No more front-page spreads. No more courtroom sketches aired during prime time. But that didn't mean it was gone. It meant it had learned. Many of the families, especially in New York, shifted focus. No more flashy killings. No more public feuds. Just money. Steady, patient, and mostly legal. They leaned on construction scams, bid rigging, no-show jobs, businesses that seemed clean but served a purpose, places where deals could be made, where loyalty could be rewarded, where cash could move without notice. And when violence came, it came quietly. Gone were the days of bodies in car trunks or messages sent through bullets. The killings that happened were rare, careful, and mostly internal. Problem solvers, not statements. Because in this version of the Mafia, noise was a weakness. Silence was strength, and anyone who forgot that was quickly reminded. The FBI still watched. So did local police, state agencies, task forces. But many of them had shifted focus to newer threats: cybercrime, terrorism, international drug networks. And while the Mafia still appeared on their radar, it was rarely the top priority. That gave the remaining families space, not to grow, but to survive. Survival was the new goal. No one expected to build empires anymore. No one talked about controlling cities or dominating industries. They talked about keeping their heads down, keeping their crews tight, and keeping the money moving. The ambition of earlier decades had been replaced with caution, and that caution kept many of them out of prison. But not all. Every few years, an arrest would remind the public that the Mafia still existed. A capo caught running an illegal gambling ring. A soldier picked up for extortion. A quiet man in his 60s accused of ordering a hit 20 years earlier. And each time, reporters dusted off the old terms: mob ties, Cosa Nostra, crime family. For a few days, it would feel like the old days again. Then the headlines would fade, because attention didn't help. Not the families, not the investigators, and certainly not the communities still shaped by these men. Most people wanted peace, stability, normalcy. And the Mafia, if nothing else, understood how to provide that, as long as they weren't challenged, as long as the rules were followed. And there were still rules, old ones, unwritten, passed down like prayers. Don't speak. Don't steal from your own. Don't harm civilians. Don't involve family in business. Don't use drugs. Some were followed. Some were ignored. But they still mattered, not because they were perfect, but because they gave shape to something otherwise undefined. Because the Mafia had always been more than crime. It was a structure, a culture, a way of living outside the system while creating your own. For some, it was a prison. For others, a path. For many, it was both. And yet, beneath it all, something else lingered. A question, unspoken but ever present. How long could it last? The world had changed too much. Surveillance was constant. Privacy was gone. Even the simplest crimes left digital trails. A burner phone still pinged towers. A fake ID was cross-checked in seconds. A money order could trigger a red flag, and every mistake became a file, a record, a possibility. Younger recruits were harder to find. Fewer men wanted the life. It wasn't glamorous anymore. There was no promise of power, no guarantee of wealth, only risk, prison, paranoia. And for many, that wasn't worth it. The idea of belonging still pulled some in, but not enough to rebuild what had been lost. The old generation was aging out. Some died in prison, others faded into quiet retirement. A few wrote books, told their stories, some with regret, others with pride, but always with the same tone. Something had been lost. Something had changed. And no one knew if it could be brought back. Not really, because Cosa Nostra had never been about one man. It had been about the network, the silence, the understanding that no one explained. And as the culture shifted, that understanding began to fray. But it never vanished. Even now there were whispers, rumors, a name said in passing, a place to avoid, a favor asked in the right tone. And sometimes those whispers still mattered, not because they were loud, but because they were remembered. And remembering in this world was everything. By the mid-2010s, the Mafia had become something almost mythical, a shadow of itself, a name more often found in documentaries than in police files. But for those who paid attention, for those who watched closely, it was still there. Smaller, yes, quieter, but never fully gone. And some places still held on to the old rhythm. Neighborhoods in Queens, pockets of Staten Island, a few corners in the Bronx. In these places, old men still stood on corners, talking low and slow. Coffee shops still had booths that were always taken, and small businesses still made cash-only deals that never showed up in any ledger. It wasn't what it had been, but it wasn't dead. It had simply learned to survive differently. You couldn't run the docks anymore, but you could still rig a contract. You couldn't skim millions from casinos, but you could skim thousands from construction sites. The jobs were smaller, the profits thinner. But for those still involved, it was enough. Because what mattered now wasn't building an empire. It was staying out of prison. Some of the names had changed. The sons and nephews of old bosses took over. Not all of them, not even most, but a few. Men who grew up hearing stories over dinner, who watched their uncles disappear into prison and return 15 years later, thinner, quieter, but still respected. For some, the choice wasn't even a choice. It was a path already carved, and while many wanted no part of it, others leaned in. They studied the rules, watched the mistakes of the past, knew what drew heat and what didn't. They kept their circles tight. No outsiders, no flash, no unnecessary risk. They moved money through smaller hands, trusted fewer people, hid in plain sight, and for a while it worked. Because the truth was, most people had stopped looking. Law enforcement still filed reports, still made arrests. But the Mafia was no longer the threat it had once been. Gangs, cartels, cybercrime, terrorism, these took priority. And in the gaps between these larger targets, the old crews continued, quietly, carefully. But even silence can't protect everything. Every so often, something slipped. A careless word, a recorded meeting, a grudge turned into a tip. And when that happened, the whole house shook. Because even a small bust could bring years of surveillance into focus. One wrong move could expose dozens of men, not because they were careless, but because the world had changed. It was no longer enough to stay quiet. You had to be invisible, and invisibility came at a cost. Fewer meetings, fewer relationships, less trust. The very thing that had made the Mafia strong, its structure, its brotherhood, had become its weakness. Because now connection meant exposure, and exposure meant time. Still, the code remained, not written, not spoken, just understood. You don't talk. You don't cooperate. You don't betray. Most followed it. Some didn't. And those who broke it were rarely forgotten. In this world, even without armies or territories, consequences still mattered. There was still fear, not loud, not theatrical, but quiet, present. A tension in the air when certain names were spoken, a pause before answering certain questions, and always the sense that someone was watching, listening, waiting, because in this world the past never truly died. It just waited for the right moment to return, and in some ways it always did, because history repeats itself. Younger men, drawn by stories, sometimes tried to bring it back, to restore what had been lost. They wore suits, held meetings, quoted rules they barely understood, and sometimes they succeeded for a while. But most of the time, they underestimated what the Mafia had once been and what it now required to survive. Because surviving wasn't about strength, it was about patience. And patience was hard to teach. Still, in the quiet places, it continued. Not as a legend, not as a film, but as a habit. A phone call answered in code. A favor done without question. A name dropped in conversation that made others lean in. And in those moments, the old world felt close. Not gone, just hidden. Waiting, always waiting. Some believed the Mafia had ended in courtrooms. Others thought it had ended in headlines. But the truth was simpler. It hadn't ended. It had adapted. And by the 2020s, that adaptation had become its nature. Not flashy, not powerful, but persistent, like water in cracks. Always there. The big names were mostly gone, the ones that made front pages, that wore silk suits and smiled at cameras, the ones that ordered hits in daylight and held court like kings. Those men were either dead, imprisoned, or quietly living out their last years in modest homes, far from the streets they once controlled. But the system they built, or tried to build, hadn't disappeared. It had shifted. In cities like New York, it still moved. In small ways. Behind the scenes. A trash hauling contract, a concrete supplier, a protection deal that never made it to paper. The numbers were smaller, the attention even more so. But that was the point. The Mafia didn't need headlines. It needed space. And in the shadows of a busy world, it found just enough. Law enforcement still watched, still made arrests, still named operations with clever titles. But most cases were quiet. A few men here, a few charges there, often nonviolent, always complex, because violence brought heat, and heat was the one thing no one wanted. So they stayed small, careful, forgettable, and yet the structure remained. There were still bosses, still captains, still soldiers. The names changed, the faces changed, but the roles were the same. A boss gave orders, a captain enforced them, a soldier earned, and somewhere in the middle decisions were made, often over coffee, rarely over threats, because threats drew attention, and attention no longer brought fear. It brought surveillance, indictments, years of trials and transcripts. So the language changed, less direct, more coded, less about control, more about access. If someone needed something moved, someone else had the right truck. If a bid needed help, someone knew the right name. Nothing large, nothing dramatic, just useful. And usefulness kept things going. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about staying needed. A contractor who never missed a deadline. A restaurant that never asked questions. A fixer who didn't need instructions. These were the new players, often clean on paper, but always available. And in the new version of the Mafia, that availability was currency. Money still moved, not in duffel bags or under mattresses, but through wires, shell companies, real estate, small firms that did just enough business to seem real. And when things went wrong, they went wrong quietly. A partner removed, a property sold, a deal canceled, no violence, just redirection. Because in this world, silence wasn't just tradition, it was strategy. And the younger members, those rare few still drawn to the life, learned it quickly. They didn't quote movies, they didn't talk about honor. They listened, watched, learned who to trust, who to avoid, and most of all, who had survived. Because those who survived weren't the loudest. They were the ones who never made the papers. And while some longed for the past, the rules, the respect, the simplicity, most accepted the truth. The Mafia had changed. It had to. The world was faster now, smarter, less patient. And in that world, the old ways didn't work. But parts of them still mattered. Respect, loyalty, quiet. Those values still meant something, not just in theory, but in practice. A handshake still closed a deal. A quiet word still held weight. A warning, softly spoken, still mattered. And in that space, the Mafia found its place, not above the law, not against it, just around it, carefully, quietly. And for those still involved, that was enough, because not everyone wanted empires. Some just wanted to belong. Outside the organization, most people assumed it was over, a relic, something from the past, like payphones or newspapers, occasionally mentioned, rarely seen. But those inside knew better, because disappearance had always been part of the plan. The quieter it became, the longer it lasted. There were still men who remembered, not just the names or the faces, but the feel of it, the way things moved, the way respect was given and taken. They remembered the long nights, the whispered calls, the knocks on doors that always came in twos. And those men, though older now, still carried influence. They didn't give speeches. They didn't post online. They just existed, and their presence kept the structure from collapsing. In some cities, the families were almost ceremonial. A handful of men meeting out of habit more than strategy. They played cards, traded favors, talked about old times. Their businesses kept going, not because they were powerful, but because no one cared enough to stop them. And in that space, they persisted. In other places, the structure was more alive, still organized, still cautious, still waiting, not for a comeback, not for revenge, just for opportunity. Because crime, like everything else, runs in cycles. And while the Mafia no longer ruled the streets, it still understood timing, when to move, when to stop, when to listen, and when to disappear. The newest members were different. They didn't grow up with the same codes. They didn't hear stories at the dinner table. They found the life through necessity, not tradition. Some had debts, others had skills. Most just wanted something they couldn't find elsewhere, a sense of control in a world that offered none. But initiation still required approval, still required a vote, still required a ceremony, maybe smaller, maybe less formal, but no less serious. A candle, a card, a promise. And once inside, you were expected to understand. The rules weren't explained anymore. They were implied. You followed or you left, or worse, because consequences still existed, just more quietly. A man who talked too much found himself pushed out. A crew that got sloppy found its money cut off. A name that caused too much noise stopped getting mentioned. It wasn't about punishment. It was about distance. Silence was the new sword, and exile the new sentence. And it worked, because what survived wasn't the violence. It was the discipline, the understanding that trust was everything, that your name meant something, that one mistake didn't just cost you. It cost the people around you, your crew, your friends, your family. So mistakes weren't tolerated. They were erased. The FBI still made arrests, still issued press releases, still listed names on long charts connected by lines and arrows. But those charts didn't show everything. They missed the conversations that never happened, the favors never spoken aloud, the handshakes that never left a paper trail, because real power never advertised itself. And in that absence, myths grew. You'd hear stories in barbershops, in coffee shops, a friend of a friend. A name whispered at the end of a long sentence. Most of it wasn't true. Some of it was. But the line between fact and fiction didn't matter. What mattered was belief, and belief kept the idea alive, even when everything else faded. In movies and shows, the Mafia was loud, explosions, betrayals, gunfire in the streets. But the real version, the one that still lingered, was almost invisible. A man in his 70s who still got paid first. A phone number that never changed. A restaurant that always had one table open. And that was enough. Because this wasn't about control anymore. It was about presence. Knowing who to call, where to go, what not to ask. These things still mattered. Maybe not in every neighborhood, maybe not to most people. But to a few, they were everything. And those few made sure it continued, not for glory, not for legacy, just because it was still there. By the middle of the 2020s, the idea of the Mafia had split in two. There was the version that lived in memory, sharp suits, backroom deals, whispered threats. And then there was the version that still moved quietly through certain parts of the country, smaller, older, but not gone. In New York, a few families still operated. The names had changed, the neighborhoods had shifted, but the rhythm remained. An unmarked office over a bakery, a small team that never posted photos, a few men who only met in person. They didn't talk about loyalty, they proved it. And if you didn't understand, you weren't invited back. There were no business cards, no applications, just introductions, a cousin, a friend, a neighbor who asked the right question at the right time. And if that question landed well, it led somewhere, not fast, not directly, just enough to know you'd been noticed, that you were being watched, not as a threat, but as a possibility, because growth was slow now. Too fast meant heat, too much meant exposure, and the lesson had been learned many times and at great cost. So every move was measured. Every dollar earned was tracked, not on paper, not online, but in memory, in agreement, in principle. And principle still mattered. You didn't cut corners. You didn't talk. You didn't promise things you couldn't deliver. And if someone vouched for you, their name was on the line. That still meant something. Maybe not in most industries, but here it mattered more than money. Money still flowed, but differently. There were no big scores, no suitcases of cash, just steady, quiet income, a small piece of a service contract, a quiet role in a shipping deal, a loan repaid in interest without question. And when things went wrong, they were handled quietly. A visit, a conversation, sometimes nothing more than a look. And that look still had weight, not because of fear, but because of memory. Because even if younger members didn't remember the old bosses, they remembered the rules. They knew that if something was handled the wrong way, it reflected badly on the person who brought them in. And no one wanted that kind of attention. So mistakes were rare, not because everyone was perfect, but because those who made them didn't last long. Sometimes they were removed. Sometimes they walked away on their own. Either way, the structure kept moving. No noise, no drama, just the quiet replacement of one part with another. That was how it worked now. No headlines, no trials, just adjustment. And even the authorities recognized it. Most investigations didn't lead to large takedowns. They found small things, a fraud case, an extortion claim. But even when the cases were weak, the names still drew attention, and that attention reminded the families to stay even quieter, even smaller, because every name came with history. And history, in this world, was dangerous. Some names hadn't been heard in years, but they still carried weight, still opened doors, still ended conversations. And if you used one, you'd better have a reason, because nothing was more dangerous than pretending to be connected when you weren't. The Mafia had never liked lies, at least not the kind told to insiders, and in that way the old spirit remained. The silence, the caution, the sense that not everything needed to be explained, that some things were understood without words, that the men who really mattered never had to say they mattered. They just did. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't glamorous. It was a way of existing, one that had survived prison sentences, surveillance, and changing times, not because it was strong, but because it was patient, flexible, willing to wait as long as it took. And that patience was still the most dangerous thing about it, because when something waits long enough, people forget it's still there, until it moves again. Sometimes people asked if the Mafia was still around, usually in a quiet voice, usually followed by a story, a name someone remembered, a man who seemed to have connections but never said much, a restaurant where no one spoke loudly. These weren't facts, but they weren't fiction either, because in some places the past never left. It just became harder to find. That was the point. Visibility had been the mistake. The suits, the clubs, the parades, all of it had brought too much attention. The Mafia wasn't built for attention. It was built for structure, for repetition, for quiet deals and reliable silence. And in those corners, it still worked. The jobs had changed. It wasn't about stealing trucks or hijacking shipments. It was about placement, a man in the right office, a company with the right contract, a crew that handled permits and schedules without drawing eyes. Nothing flashy, just leverage. And leverage, properly used, was more powerful than force, because violence, once common, now cost too much, not just in lives, in time, in evidence, in headlines. Every gunshot created a file. Every broken window became a photo, and photos led to courtrooms. So the smart ones stopped using force. They used memory instead, reminded people quietly what had happened to others who forgot the rules. And most people remembered. That memory held the system together. It wasn't written down, but it was real. If you paid late, someone noticed. If you didn't call back, someone remembered. And if you crossed a line, someone would tell you. Once. No threats, no yelling, just clarity. And if you listened, that was the end of it. If not, then something changed. A door didn't open, a deal got delayed, a payment didn't arrive. No one said why, but you knew. And that knowing, that quiet pressure, worked better than anything else, because it didn't just scare you, it isolated you. And isolation, in this world, was worse than punishment, because punishment was over quickly. Isolation lasted, and that was the true power, not fear, but absence, not being shouted at, but being ignored, cut off, removed from the circle, because the circle, even small, still had meaning, and people still wanted to belong, not for wealth, not for glory, for access to names, to phone numbers, to people who could fix things, who could arrange meetings, who could move papers from one desk to another without delay. That access was everything, and once you had it, you didn't want to lose it. So people obeyed, not because they had to, but because they wanted to stay connected. The Mafia was no longer about territories. It was about networks, thin threads, carefully tied. If one broke, the rest shifted, adjusted, realigned. There was no panic, no meetings with raised voices, just quiet replacements, quiet movement, quiet strength. And through it all, the names stayed hidden, not erased, just buried deep, only used when necessary, and when used well. There were still bosses, not like before, not with limousines or press clippings, but with weight. A man who could end a conversation with a look, who didn't need to raise his voice, who never had to remind anyone who he was. Because if you didn't know, you weren't supposed to, and captains still worked under them, managing small teams, handling small jobs, keeping everything steady. Their power wasn't dramatic, it was dependable. And dependability in this world was as valuable as anything else. The men at the bottom still earned, not millions, but enough. Enough to pay bills, enough to stay useful, and as long as you were useful, you were safe. That was the rule, unspoken, but understood, and through it all, the same idea remained. Belonging, not control, not chaos, just the quiet sense that you were part of something that still mattered. In some ways, the Mafia of today didn't feel like a family anymore. Not in the old sense, not in the Sunday dinners and neighborhood patrols. It was smaller, colder, more efficient. The warmth was gone, but the structure remained, and structure was survival. A job was done, a payment was made, a word was passed. No emotion, just flow. Everyone knew their part, and if they didn't stay long, because mistakes weren't forgiven quickly. There was no time for long explanations or second chances. You learned fast or left quietly. The streets were different now. Cameras on every corner, phones in every hand. Nothing was private, everything recorded. And that changed the rules. What used to be done with a nod now required 3 layers of space. What used to be said in 5 words now took none. Silence became the new language, and everyone understood it. The old men watched it change. Some stayed, others walked away. A few disappeared without a sound. They had lived through the golden years, the decline, the quiet survival, and for them the new era was both familiar and foreign. The rules were the same, but the rhythm had changed. No more shoeshine boys with envelopes, no more messages in folded napkins, just names whispered, numbers memorized, places never written down. The Mafia had become its own echo. You could hear it if you listened, in the way someone paused before answering, in the way a favor was offered without being requested, in the way certain people were never mentioned aloud. It wasn't gone. It had just gone deeper, and deep things are hard to kill. Newer members didn't talk much. They didn't ask questions. They followed signals. They learned through observation. And when they were trusted, they received more. Not in gifts, in access, in proximity to men who still mattered. Because in this world, being near the right person was worth more than any promise. Reputation wasn't something you claimed. It was given to you slowly, piece by piece, a nod, a task, a seat at a table. Nothing loud, but everything meaningful. And once you had it, you protected it. Because in a structure built on quiet weight, reputation was your only shield. You didn't wear it. You lived it. If someone questioned you, others answered for you. That was the test. That was the line between being in and being around. There was still risk, not like before, but present. A phone call traced, a photo misread, a wrong word in the wrong ear. It didn't take much. And the law, while slower now, still paid attention. Every few years, someone made a mistake. And when that happened, the whole circle shifted. Not with panic, with silence. A crew vanished. A meeting stopped. A contact removed. No one explained. They didn't need to, because the goal was never revenge. It was continuity, and continuity required movement. Quiet, steady, strategic movement. So they moved, not across borders, across conversations. The right favor in the right place. A small deal to keep a door open. A kind word passed from one ear to another. These weren't crimes, they were steps. And each step, if taken properly, led to more. If taken poorly, led nowhere. This was the new method. Less command, more suggestion, less presence, more influence. And it worked because it was unprovable. You couldn't charge someone for a feeling. And feelings, in this world, shaped more decisions than threats ever had. Some missed the old ways, the power, the clarity, but most understood. The world had changed, and if you didn't change with it, you didn't last. So they adapted, and in that adaptation, something strange happened. They became stronger, not in numbers, not in control, but in survival. Because survival wasn't about force, it was about fit. And the Mafia, for all its history, had learned how to fit, not just into the city, into the system, into the cracks and corners where no one looked anymore. By now, even the word itself had changed. Mafia, Cosa Nostra. It didn't mean what it used to. To most people, it was history. A story told in black and white photos and faded court documents. Something between myth and memory. But to a few, it was still real, still moving, still listening. The younger generation rarely used the term. They didn't need to. If you were part of it, you knew. If you weren't, no word could bring you closer. The structure didn't rely on names. It relied on actions, on habits, on the quiet repetition of behaviors that signaled trust. There were no written rules, but they were followed anyway. Don't speak, don't ask, don't assume. Watch first, then move. And if you moved correctly, you were noticed, not rewarded, not praised, just remembered. And in this world, being remembered was everything. The crews were smaller now. A few men, a few roles, a few steady routes. There was no need for 50 people in suits. lining a sidewalk. Just 5 men who showed up on time, who kept their heads down, who handled business with clean hands and quiet voices. They weren't soldiers in the old sense. They were operators, earners, connectors, men who could take a request and turn it into a result without needing instructions. And those who could do that consistently rose, not fast, not loudly, but steadily. Because this wasn't a race, it was a pattern, one that repeated itself year after year. A quiet lunch, a favor returned, a piece of information shared at just the right time. And when something serious needed handling, it was passed along without ceremony. The job was done, the results were seen, and then it was never spoken of again. The silence wasn't just strategy, it was identity. They didn't just avoid attention, they had forgotten what it looked like. There were no celebrations, no gatherings, no stories over drinks, just movement, from place to place, from name to name, always one layer away from exposure, always half a step ahead of curiosity, and yet the loyalty remained. You didn't switch crews. You didn't walk away without reason. If you wanted out, you stayed silent. If you stayed in, you kept moving. And either way, you didn't explain yourself, because explanation was noise, and noise was weakness. The older bosses still watched from a distance. They didn't interfere often, but their presence was known. A glance, a nod, a word passed through someone else. Their influence wasn't measured by what they said, but by what others didn't say around them. They had survived, and survival, more than power, had become the highest mark of respect. They had lived through raids, through trials, through years in silence, and when they returned, they didn't brag. They sat quietly, watched the room, and if someone asked for advice, they gave it with 3 words or less, because words, once cheap, had become valuable, and those who knew when to use them had more power than anyone shouting on a screen. Technology made the game harder. Everything was tracked. Everyone was connected. The idea of privacy had become a joke, and in that world, the Mafia had to become even more invisible. No texts, no emails, no recorded meetings, just presence, just memory. They used restaurants, hardware stores, garages, places where a meeting looked like a coincidence, and where the right kind of silence could stretch across an hour without feeling strange. Because in this business, silence wasn't awkward. It was efficient. You didn't talk unless something needed to be said. And when something needed to be said, it was brief. You did your job, then you left. And in that rhythm, the structure continued, not strong, not large, but alive. By the late 2020s, the FBI had quietly acknowledged something it rarely said aloud. The Mafia, while no longer a dominant criminal empire, had found a new equilibrium. It wasn't gone. It wasn't harmless. It had simply evolved, and that made it harder to stop. No longer were agents chasing flashy dons or gunfights in restaurants. Now they were chasing shadows, small crews with legitimate covers, men with clean records, paper trails that looked like normal business. There were still investigations, still indictments, but the charges were narrower, the targets more elusive. A federal prosecutor in Brooklyn once said off the record that the Mafia had learned to wear a different suit, one with no label, one that didn't raise eyebrows. It walked like a business. It billed like a contractor. It answered its phones during business hours. But when it needed to, it disappeared for days without anyone noticing. Surveillance operations had to stretch months just to confirm a single meeting. Wiretaps yielded less because the old code had returned. No phones, no details. Men spoke in person or not at all, and when they spoke, it was indirect. That thing with the guy from uptown might refer to 5 different matters. No clarity, no evidence, and yet money still moved. Federal agents tracked unusual deposits, offshore transfers, shell companies with no employees. In many cases, the businesses were real. They provided a service, but the pricing was always slightly too high, the clients always too consistent, and when asked about it, the owners shrugged. Good luck, maybe. Luck in this world had a long memory. One such front was a string of auto body shops in northern New Jersey. On paper, they were independent. In practice, they operated under quiet coordination, shared parts, shared customers, shared silence. Each year, investigators tried to prove it was a network. Each year, they failed because nothing illegal was being done, at least not obviously. The shops paid their taxes, filed their documents, passed inspections, but people noticed how quickly problems disappeared when certain names were mentioned. A permit issue resolved overnight. A local supplier offering sudden discounts. A zoning board reversing a decision. All legal, all coincidental, until you noticed the pattern. In another case, a set of construction projects in Queens raised red flags. Different companies, different developers, but the subcontractors repeated. So did the equipment, so did the laborers. And while the buildings went up without incident, inspectors noticed the same foreman at sites supposedly run by different firms. He never spoke much, just watched, then moved on. When asked about him, no one had a last name, just Tony or the guy with the clipboard. But every time a dispute came up, over pay, over delays, over permits, it got resolved with a single call. Not aggressive, not threatening, just effective. And that was the essence of it. Efficiency over intimidation, coordination over control, results over drama. The Mafia didn't need to own the city anymore. It just needed to stay in the right rooms. And in many cases, it did. Quietly, persistently, through friendships formed over decades, through marriages that crossed neighborhoods, through favors that no one ever admitted receiving. No one bragged, no one boasted. That era was over. But what remained was a structure too deep to erase, not because it was protected, but because it was useful. In the background of all this activity, something else had taken root, a network of influence that no longer looked like a criminal empire, but more like a legacy institution. The Mafia no longer needed to control every part of the process. It just needed to touch it once. A judge who remembered a name from years ago, a union rep whose father owed someone a favor, a politician who received early donations through clean hands, but from a dirty source. Nothing direct, nothing traceable, but every piece connected softly, like a thread pulled tight only when necessary. This influence didn't always result in action. Often it did nothing at all. But when something had to happen, a permit moved faster, a complaint delayed, a difficult person transferred, the invisible hand acted, and after the result came, the hand withdrew again. No one was thanked, no one was blamed, no one was named. That was the brilliance of it. Invisibility had become the new measure of success. A generation ago, power meant being feared. Now it meant never being noticed. The families still gathered, not often, not publicly. Sometimes just two men at a diner speaking in circles over a plate of eggs. Other times it was a funeral, a wedding, a christening, and while others came for the occasion, those in the life came for the presence. A nod, a shared glance, the reaffirmation that the network still existed. One such gathering took place in Long Island in the summer of 2023, a wedding, simple and tasteful, in a rented garden. Among the guests were three men whose names hadn't appeared in any indictment for over 20 years. They weren't listed as suspects. They weren't on wiretaps. But they were known, and they were watching. One of them had been a captain in the old days. Another had served time for racketeering in the late 90s. The third had never been charged with anything at all. But every few minutes, younger men approached, greeted them softly, asked polite questions. They were not given answers, just gestures, smiles, permission to continue. This was how the structure survived, through memory, through approval, through the kind of slow-moving trust that takes decades to earn and seconds to lose. In the years following the height of prosecution, the remaining families had developed a new kind of hierarchy, not written down, not even spoken aloud, but clear. Those who had done time were at the top, not because of violence or ambition, but because of silence, because they hadn't talked, because they had come back and never complained. These men didn't command operations anymore. They were symbols, living reminders of how things were done properly. And just their presence was enough to settle disputes, to calm younger members, to remind everyone of the cost of mistakes. The Mafia had never been built to last 100 years. It had been built to survive one more week, one more month, one more generation. And in its quietest years, that survival became its greatest success. No headlines meant no disruption. No violence meant no surveillance. No loose ends meant no stories. And yet, now and then, a problem would appear. Someone would get greedy. Someone would get loud. A crew would start moving too fast. It happened in Brooklyn once. A younger man, eager to prove himself, pushed a local gambling operation into new territory. Within weeks, someone noticed. Not the police, not the FBI, the old men. They didn't send threats. They didn't send anyone at all. They pulled the funding. They stopped answering calls. Within days, the expansion stopped. No one talked about it. The young man stayed home. The crew dissolved, and the balance returned. Because in this new world, punishment didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to be quiet and permanent. Sometimes the most telling moments were the smallest ones. A bakery in Staten Island that never seemed to close. A locksmith's van that parked near construction sites but never unloaded tools. A man in a suit who walked the same block every morning, stopping only once, at a newsstand that hadn't changed in 20 years. To outsiders, these were background details. To those who knew, they were signs. The Mafia had become a language, a quiet one, full of pauses, half sentences, and glances. You didn't speak it unless you'd earned it, and even then you only used it when necessary. But those who could read it saw the pattern. The bakery's owner had retired years ago, but the shop stayed open. Staff rotated, but one man remained in the back room. He didn't bake, he didn't serve customers, but he was always there, and anyone who needed to ask a favor came during the hours he worked. No appointments, no paperwork, just presence. The locksmith's van belonged to a man in his 60s, never charged too much, never advertised. But if you had the right reference, he could open more than doors, not illegally, just effectively. He knew building codes better than inspectors, knew how to delay an audit, knew which stairwells had blind spots. And the man at the newsstand, no one knew where he lived. He didn't carry a phone, didn't speak more than a few words. But every week, someone handed him a small envelope folded in thirds. He never looked at it, just tucked it into his jacket. Sometimes 2 envelopes, never more than 3. Always the same fold, always the same silence. These weren't criminal acts, not directly, but they kept the machine oiled. No part moved alone, no piece too large. That was the point. There were no bosses in the way the newspapers once described, no aging men behind long tables, shouting orders over dinner. The real ones, the few who still held the strings, operated more like curators. They didn't issue commands, they nudged, they adjusted, they corrected. One of them lived near the Bronx River Parkway. He spent most days on his porch, watching, drinking coffee, occasionally reading. His phone rarely rang, but when it did, he answered without greeting, said a few words, then hung up. The calls lasted under a minute, always. His name didn't appear in any file. But when a problem emerged in Yonkers, something small, a delivery dispute, his opinion ended the matter. He didn't leave his porch, but the problem disappeared. Because when systems work silently, control looks like coincidence. There were no meetings, no plans written down, just continuity. One person handed off to another. If a crew lost a man, they filled the space quietly. If a venue changed hands, the same agreement stayed in place. If a new player entered the field, they were either absorbed or ignored. Absorption was safer. Ignorance was final. Everyone knew the rules. You didn't challenge without invitation. You didn't move money through unknown names. And if you tried to take something that wasn't yours, you weren't corrected. You were excluded. Permanently, without threat, without warning. A florist in Queens once tried to skim from an arrangement deal. He was never spoken to directly. But within a week, his suppliers changed their rates. His orders were delayed. Deliveries were missed. He closed 3 months later, and no one mentioned his name again, because enforcement no longer required confrontation. It required agreement. Everyone involved had something to lose, a shop, a route, a reputation, and so everyone played their part, not out of fear, out of understanding, because in a system built on history, no one wanted to be the one who forgot it. The Mafia no longer moved with fire. It moved like smoke, through vents, through cracks, through forgotten channels in old buildings that no longer showed up on maps. And if you tried to follow it, all you found was empty air. But if you watched closely, you saw the signs. Not illegal, not obvious, just consistent. And in that consistency, it thrived. By the 2030s, some experts began to quietly redefine what the Mafia had become. It was no longer just organized crime. It had turned into organized presence, a system of familiar people in familiar places, doing familiar things, all within the rules, but always at the edge of something larger. It didn't look like crime. It looked like routine. An old man still signed off on shipping manifests at a pier in Brooklyn. He'd been there for 30 years, never promoted, never fired, always on time. And while his name appeared on no list, nothing left that pier without his quiet approval. Not because he was feared, but because he was known, because he had never caused trouble. And that was what mattered. You didn't cause trouble, you managed it. In some circles, the phrase, "friend of ours," still had weight. It didn't open doors like it used to, but it closed questions. If you were introduced with that phrase, people knew to stop asking, not out of fear, out of custom, because the phrase came with a history, a chain of trust that reached backward further than anyone wanted to admit. In Philadelphia, a similar pattern emerged. A handful of businesses, catering companies, parking lots, cleaning services, all with different names, different owners, different tax IDs, but they never competed. Their schedules never overlapped, and when one had a problem, the others helped without being asked. The owners never claimed affiliation, never mentioned the past, but their fathers had known each other. Their uncles had attended the same weddings, and when an outsider tried to undercut prices, none of them lowered their rates. The outsider closed in 2 months. This was how power now operated, not through force, through coordination, and coordination in its purest form was invisible. In Miami, a real estate firm expanded rapidly in a neighborhood long considered risky. They bought properties in cash, renovated quickly, sold quietly. When questioned, the agents shrugged. Good timing, they said. A market opportunity, but the timing was too perfect. The renovations too smooth, the permits too fast, and those who watched closely saw something familiar, a pattern of movement designed not to raise attention, but to flow without friction. Local inspectors never found violations. Contractors were always paid. The tenants never complained. And while no one mentioned it, the firm's main partner had once owned a trucking company in New Jersey, a company that disappeared in the early 2000s after a federal probe, never indicted, never convicted, just dissolved. And yet, here he was again. New name, new industry, same calm rhythm, same respect in the way people paused when his name was spoken. The Mafia no longer needed to control industries. It only needed to move through them. The old methods, gambling, extortion, loan sharking, still existed in fragments. But they were no longer the focus, too visible, too difficult. Now it was about placement, a quiet chair at the right table, a company that no one questioned, a phone call returned promptly, even if no one knew why. Everything depended on time, not speed, but endurance. If you stayed long enough, people stopped questioning you. They assumed you belonged. And once you belonged, you didn't have to prove anything. The real players never argued. They nodded. They listened. They moved things forward by moving nothing at all. And that was the secret. The less you did, the more they gave. Because in a system where noise drew eyes, silence drew trust. The Mafia had become something closer to a habit than an organization. You recognized it by feel. By the way, someone delayed a meeting. By the way, a price never changed. By the way, two unrelated businesses used the same accountant. It wasn't a shadow government. It was a shadow rhythm. And like all rhythms, it kept time, quietly. There was never a final moment, no great collapse, no funeral for the old ways. The Mafia didn't end. It dissolved, reshaped, lingered, and in that lingering it found new life, not in power, not in fear, but in relevance, in quiet adaptation. The story stretched across generations, from the dusty roads of Sicily to the streets of New York, from prohibition prophets to casino empires, from wiretaps and courtrooms to whispers and coded silences. Every stage of the journey was marked by change, and the greatest strength of Cosa Nostra had never been loyalty or violence. It was its ability to change shape. The old families were still remembered, not as rulers, but as reminders. Their names carved into the corners of old neighborhoods, their faces hanging in faded photos above the counters of cafes that still served espresso in porcelain cups. Not worshipped, not denied, just there. In many ways, they had become folklore. The names still carried weight, not in business deals, but in the way people lowered their voices when they said them, in the way older men paused before answering certain questions, in the way younger ones watched the room before they spoke. This was the legacy, not control, but awareness, and awareness lasted longer than fear. A new generation came up with no blood ties, no memory of the 5 families, no connection to the commission or the wars that tore it apart. But they learned anyway, quietly, indirectly, through behavior, through caution, through the pattern, because the pattern still worked. You didn't rush. You didn't speak when listening would do. You didn't ask for more than you needed. And you never, ever drew attention. These weren't rules taught by books. They were passed through observation, through imitation, through silence. The few who understood were brought closer. The rest moved on, never realizing how close they had come to something that still moved beneath the surface. The FBI still had files, some thick, some thin, some old, some updated, but all of them now felt like a record of something that had outlived the tools used to study it. You couldn't indict a glance. You couldn't prosecute a pause. You couldn't wiretap a feeling. And that was what the Mafia had become, a feeling. You felt it when a business changed hands too quietly, when an argument ended too quickly, when someone with no obvious power made a problem disappear. You couldn't explain it, but you recognized it, and those who recognized it didn't speak of it. They just nodded and moved on. Cosa Nostra no longer ruled cities. It didn't need to. Its strength had never been in owning everything. Its strength was in being part of everything, just enough. It was the waiter who knew which table never got filled, the accountant who never asked for signatures, the notary who approved forms no one else could, the memory that moved from generation to generation without names. Even when no one said it aloud, the structure remained. The Mafia was no longer a pyramid. It was a current. It moved through cracks, through old favors, through quiet understanding. It didn't need headlines anymore. It needed memory, and memory was still loyal, not to faces, not to families, but to the idea that there was a way things were handled, a way things could be fixed without papers, without noise, without outsiders. That idea had survived a century of war, betrayal, and silence, and it would survive more, not because it deserved to, but because something always filled the space left behind when institutions fade. And sometimes that something still answers to a name, even if no one speaks it.